any of you all are familiar from the Valley used to have 50,000 jobs in largely in brass manufacturing. All of those are gone. And why are they gone, or how did those jobs effectively completely disappear? And now the Valley left with brownfields, contaminated sites. Corporate multinationals coming in, buying up factories, stripping these sites of whatever was of financial value, selling it off, people losing their jobs. This is the same thing, but with housing. People are seeing they can make a lot of money by targeting not just apartment buildings, not just smaller multifamilies, but single-family homes, and seeing that they can make a lot of money on it. Let's go to the next slide. Even more, single-family rentals are more expensive than multifamily apartment buildings. I'm bringing this up because Lori put in a bill where just cause eviction protection would be universal. The current bill is to expand 5 units or more to everyone, not just 62 or older and disabled, but to everyone who lives in complexes that are 62, that are 5 units or more. Everyone, and people would also have a probationary period who are not a part of that protected class of a year. I'm bringing this up because I want to say to all of you that the current bill that I just described, HB 1689, is the compromise. There's talk about, oh, do we need to have, more carve-outs or have more landlord sensitivity in this bill? This is the compromise. And why is this the compromise? Because this is happening, and this is happening here in Connecticut. If you knock on doors in any town in Connecticut, you will hear stories of, oh yeah, there are investors coming in and they're buying up properties. You'll even hear small landlords say, oh, I wanted to, meager way expand my portfolio, but guess what? I couldn't because an institutional investor came in and bought the property with cash. This is a very common story in all around Connecticut. This points to it. And guess what? When you see single-family rents growth on an annualized basis, this is from 2025, January 2nd, 2025. You'll see Hartford is at the top. Connecticut is consistently at the top in terms of eviction rates, and we're talking about the top cities. So Waterbury is 22nd in the country in eviction rates in the country. Next slide. Okay, this is a little all over the place, but I want to get to the depth of this. So you can see, this is from the federal government, and that's by 2022. 32 institutional investors collectively own 450,000 single-family homes. Yes?
So they buy the single-family homes and then rent them?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So if you're living in a neighborhood where you're in a single-family home, your neighbors are living in single-family homes, and you start seeing one property after another, after another, after another is being bought up, and let's say you have a mortgage that's $1,500, $1,600, $2,000, and those single-family homes are being turned into $2,800, $3,200, $4,000 rentals. Chances are that's probably, and I'm just going to speak for myself here, I'm not going to speak for others here in the panel. Chances are, right, that might have something to do with your tax liability going on, right? I mean, the market is saying that this is how much these homes are worth in your neighborhood. And your mortgage is this much, and the rentals are now this much. So, again, I'm not speaking for others here, but to give you another example of this, in Waterbury, we're also dealing with, and I'm sure a number of you have seen this on the news, Waterbury Hospital and what's been going on there, where a private equity firm bought Waterbury Hospital, and was one horror story after another, after another, after another. People, patients have to get up and go to another person's room in order to use the bathroom, because the bathrooms are not working. The lights are not working. There are leaks through the ceiling. In Waterbury Hospital, these are not even the worst stories. So that's from a private equity firm buying up a hospital. Cosmic Medical went bankrupt and now owes the city $22 million. Again, I bring this up because I'm sure a number of you have seen the stories around the corporate landlords in New Haven. what you might also see when you read those stories in New Haven Independent or elsewhere is how much are owed when it comes to liens, when it comes to water bills, when it comes to all of these kinds of things. And when firms like that go under and don't pay their taxes, who ends up footing the bill? You all do. So when we're talking about expanding tenants' rights or renters' rights, it does affect people in this group who may not be renters. How does it even, let's say, relate to human rights? This is part of the fundamental interconnectedness of all of us. Yes, that sounds very sort of broad and nice, but seriously, right? If we take it back to these points around big institutional investors who had a plan, the plan was executed around factories in the valley. Some of you might have experienced that directly. Again, 50,000 jobs gone. 50,000 very well paid, in some cases union jobs, all gone. Thousands of people losing their pensions, in some cases through the Arkansas Valley Project. We were able to save the pensions of thousands of workers, but many people did not have that, right? You worked 20, 30, 40 years and you lost your pension. Here, you might be living in your home 20, 30, 40, 50 years and you lose your home. And that could be either directly as a renter because you do not have just cause eviction protections, or it could be your neighborhood has been entirely swallowed up by an institutional investor, and now you're left with this huge tax liability, but just because of a revow will be jacked up because of what you're surrounded by in luxury apartments, or it might be jacked up because of the story I just played out for you with Waterbury Hospital, where they owe again $22 million, and there's no telling. In a town like Waterbury, which has become a distressed municipality because of the past rating, the same folks, or in spirit the same folks, are coming back for more. If I'm an institutional investor, or not even, if I'm a person who sees, oh, there's a certain shell game that's working really well here, and I see a state or a set of towns do not have just cause eviction protections, well, looks like I can come in, buy a bunch of properties, and kick people out. It's very clear. So there's been talk about how this affects housing supply. Oh, if we have these kinds of barriers in place, not rights or protections, but barriers in place, those will be barriers to the development of housing and affordable housing. So Kayla wrote a really great op-ed on how this doesn't affect the development of housing. There was a recent report from the University of Minnesota that looked at California, Oregon, and New Hampshire, very different states, very different states in size, where it showed no effect on the development of housing. And what did they look at? They looked at specifically the amount of building permits. Now, I think you can even go further in that argument. The story I'm telling you is one where people are losing their homes. So in fact, what just cause eviction protections do is protect our housing supply. All you have to do is look at the news, and you'll find familiar faces on the news, I'll be very big about that, who have had their apartments condemned up and down Connecticut through landlords letting homes fall into disrepair and kicking people out. And if you raise a complaint, you get kicked out. And then what happens afterwards? The rent gets increased. So again, this is not even, it's actually the reverse. It's not that just cause would hurt the development of housing, it would actually protect our existing housing supply. So next slide. So here's a little bit of a metaphor, some of us have played around with it. That actually our current state of the housing market is a leaky bucket. Meaning probably a number of you, if you have even a vague familiarity with what's going on with the housing crisis here in the state and in the country, what you'll constantly hear is, well, we need more affordable housing. We need more housing. And the underlying assumption there is that means we have a static supply, a static housing supply. And oh, if we just pour more water into the bucket, increase the number of units, well, we're going to hit that magic number where it all gets resolved. Now, the problem with that is the stories I'm bringing up to you right now. where we have an image in our head where we are in the static place, but actually, right, here you can see the holes in the bucket, and this is not very well done by me, right? But you can see private equity, condemned apartments, out-of-state landlords, expiring use of affordable housing. So a lot of times affordable housing is built with time expiration. All of those keep pouring out. And so it's no wonder that you think housing crisis, and it's a little bit of a daze, right? When you think about it, like, wait, there's these moving parts, and I thought we need more housing, but then there's these things with landlords and tenants over here, and something's not quite piecing together. Well, part of that is that we're actually losing a lot of units. And you can see that in all sorts of contexts, rural, suburban, urban. It is not just an urban issue. And so one argument you'll hear is, oh, just cause, that's a landlord-tenants issue. And that's a distraction. In fact, it's a harmful distraction for talking about what we need to talk about, which is the need for more affordable housing. No, it's part of how we protect our housing supply. And furthermore, a number of affordable housing developers, depending on the financing programs that they utilize, this is not something I'm necessarily an expert in, so if you have further questions on this, I can't well technically laid out way answer it. But a number of the public financing programs utilized for affordable housing will sometimes include things like this, just cause eviction protections. If you live in public housing has all sorts of protections. One thing you'll hear from developers are who develop those forms of housing in the sense of using those forms of financing is, this would actually even out the playing field. And if our concern is how are we providing safe, affordable housing, meaning a tenant can actually raise an issue or contest unfair, borderline unlivable, if not unlivable, living conditions, then we should be striving to actually start to level out the playing field. So let's go on. Now I will bring this back in terms of what this means also for renters. One thing you'll hear about, how many of you have heard of fair rent commissions? How many of you are unfamiliar with fair rent commissions? Okay, so a fair rent commission, currently every town that has 25,000 people or more is mandated to have a fair rent commission. There are about 50 towns, give or take, that have fair rent commissions. Not all of them are actually mandated towns. Some have opted into doing so because they opted in part because something like that happened, where a corporate landlord came in, bought a bunch of properties, or bought a property and jacked up the rent, and then the reaction was, oh, we need to put that in place. So what that means is what fair rent commissions have the power to do is they can determine if a rent increase or a current level of rent, say you're living in a place where it's falling apart, is a harsh and unconscionable rental price. So that means your rent could be frozen. So let's say your landlord wanted to increase your rent from $1,200 to $1,600 per month. You can file a fair rent commission complaint, and the fair rent commission can say, no, it needs to stay $1,200. It could say something in between. The fair rent commission can say, no, the rent increase can be this much, but only after this is done. You can just say, so there's a whole bunch that you can reduce rent. You could be living in an environment that is in very poor conditions, and there are cases where rent has been reduced to $1 because the conditions were that appalling until fixes were made. So fair rent commissions have a lot of power. It is not rent control. We do not have rent control or rent caps in Connecticut. It is a complaint-based, individualized form of contesting a unfair amount of rent, whether it be increase or your current rental, or the current rent you're paying that is not what you're actually paying for because of your conditions. So one thing you'll hear is, oh, we need fair rent commissions to really work. You'll even hear that in response to Just Cause. Oh, we just need to make these fair rent commissions work. Well, in Connecticut, there is a retaliation complaint law on the books, and it says you have 6 months of protections. 6 months of protections from forming a tenants union, filing complaints around code with the Fair Rent Commission. And after 6 months, basically means it's no longer considered retaliation. So you, in theory, you could file a Fair Rent Commission complaint. Your landlord could wait over 6 months, or 6 months and 1 day, and then let's say you're month to month in that case, so let's say your lease just so happens to end on that day, you're out. You're no fault evicted out, you're no cause evicted out. Who's gonna prove it otherwise? So, and the standard is very high in terms of trying to prove retaliation. And how many of you are also familiar, I'll try this, how many of you are familiar with unfair labor practices in labor? Okay, so what would be think of something that would be considered unfair labor practice. Just, you don't have to be a legal expert.
Wage theft?
Okay, wage
Does
theft,
that count?
other examples, even more mild examples. Discrimination, what could that look
Forced
like?
meetings, but with the boss.
Captivated audiences meeting?
Okay, so there are all sorts of things, right? There could be forms of harassment that even gesture at this. That doesn't exist in housing. In housing, often the standard has been, you need to get an eviction notice. Now, if a landlord is engaging in all sorts of harassing or discriminatory activity that is short of eviction, and I can't say that's retaliation, that's a pretty high barrier to say I'm being retaliated against. And then if we're talking about actually entering past the notice to quit, and we could talk about the eviction process a little bit as well. But let's say you actually go into court, by the book, that's supposed to be off your record. It's supposed to be off of the court website after 30 days if you've won your eviction case or if the eviction suit has been dropped. Now, what happens a lot is that companies that conduct background checks for landlords scrape the data off of these websites. And so you'll end up finding that many tenants will say, oh, I'm past this 30-day period, I wasn't actually evicted. An eviction happens when a judge orders you must go. I won my case even, or I had it dropped, but this still keeps popping up. How is this possible? So yes, we have all sorts of rights. You can go to a Fair Rent Commission, you can file housing code complaints, and I'm not gonna say it never works. It can work, and it does work for people. But there is a certain imbalance of power here between what the composition of the housing market looks like and what the laws effectively are able to do in that context as well, that dramatically weaken those rights. So just cause, what just cause does is it makes those rights more real. If I can't file a Fair Rent Commission complaint without worrying that I can get evicted for no reason, is that really a right that I'm able to exercise? If I can't even raise an issue in my apartment because I'm afraid that my rent is going to be jacked up and if I can't meet that rental price, or I'm just considered a problem and I'll get kicked out, is that really a right? And so what that means is we do need to plug holes in what we have, and that's what just cause eviction does. If there actually needs to, sure, there could be a whole set of complexities coming up, right? Of course. But to actually need to produce a just reason and not just say, oh, your lease is done, you're out after I made code complaints, after I made Fair Rent Commission complaints, which in some cases Fair Rent Commissions can enforce what your code complaint is. Say your living conditions are not, I imagine maybe a number of you had to file, or deal with the health department in some way or something, or someone who has, and the thing doesn't get done, the order doesn't get met. A Fair Rent Commission is that teeth for actually, oh, there's stuff on file that you haven't gotten fixed. Well, the rent's gonna go down until you fix it. These are great things that we have. These are really good tools that we have, but they're not real and effective unless you're protected. And so this is the point about bringing the single family homes. Even though single family homes aren't covered under HB 6889, the point that I'm trying to make here is that the broader our protections are, the broader the scope is, the more we're all protected. And in the sense that the more we're able to put in place protections and fixtures that stabilize our communities, even you as homeowners are protected more so. Because if a landlord, if an institutional investor who either backs or is the corporate landlord can see, oh wait, I can't just sort of identify that hole here in that rental market and start swooping all of that up. In this case, it might be single family homes. That protects you in the long run, especially if you have no plans of leaving. Let's say you've lived in this town for, you're part of a family that's lived here for generations, and you have no plan of leaving. And let's say your neighbors, maybe it didn't play out that way for them, and they've, sold their home because someone has made a really good offer, and now you're affected because you have certain investors who come in who've seen that they can actually make a play for an entire neighborhood and swallow it up. So it does. So I'm here to say this does affect all of us, and it doesn't just affect all of us in the sense that your friend might be a renter, or your relatives might be a renter, or maybe you have a child who needs to live at home with you because they can't find a place to live anywhere because the rent is so high. These are stories we hear all the time, by the way, constantly, nonstop. I own a house and it's a 2-bedroom, but I have like 7 people who live with me. These are homes and these are stories we hear about what people's homes actually look like because of the rental market and they as homeowners. Even beyond that, it affects you even more directly in terms of what this does to the dynamics of our local residential lives. So I'll leave it there and I'll pass it on.
It's my honor to introduce, to those of you who don't know, Councilman Gallagher to tell us about sort of how we landed here, and also to introduce Caitlin Rose to talk about the decriminalizing bill.
Thank you, Lori, and thank you, Alex. That was fascinating and really helpful to listen to. Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Gallagher. I'm the councilwoman from the 4th District here in Hampton. And I'll just, many of you know our council passed back in January, Housing as a Human Right resolution, and this is part of that series of community engagement and dialogue that we wanted to have to stem from that. I just want to kind of put a little bit of context and perspective. Housing, we've been in an affordable housing crisis for many years now. Before the pandemic, coming out of the pandemic, as Alex talked about, rents have skyrocketed, and wages have not increased to that. And then now with the new administration coming in, we kind of have a whole new set of housing challenges. Right now, about 1 in 4 people who are eligible for housing assistance actually get housing assistance. So it's only 25% of the need that's met currently. That's currently. And as you may have heard with the new administration, the Trump administration is looking to really dismantle the housing infrastructure that we have available to us right now. So that 1 in 4 is going to be a lot less as we move forward. And that's why things like Just Cause are so important to ensure housing stability for folks who are currently in housing. And then we're going to talk about homelessness in a second. And those are really directly related because that pipeline, if we can't keep folks stably housed, right now we also see a dismantling of our service system. We're seeing a dismantling of Medicaid. HUD staff is being cut in half. We're seeing closures of public housing offices, local offices, and field offices across the country. And we're moving away, the administration on a federal level is moving away from best practices related to housing, so moving away from housing first, moving away from housing solutions, and moving towards things like required programs and more of criminalization and rounding folks up who experience homelessness and not using those evidence-based practices. Even to the fact that some service providers are being prevented in some places from providing services in places that are needed. And so we're seeing a real sort of movement of dismantling what we know works, which is going to make this conversation even more important. You may have heard there's at the local level, there's an institute called the Cicero Institute that's going around and trying to push legislators like state of Sweet, but not Connecticut, to pass legislation that would criminalize folks experiencing homelessness, so arresting and fining people. And that is something that we've seen just causes further damage. So when folks are arrested and criminalized, and we talked about eviction records, folks end up with not only eviction records, but with criminal records that would prevent somebody from having housing in the future, or might have more fines and create future financial strife. So it's really important right now because the context on the national level is really moving in a different direction and very quickly and in a direction that can cause a lot of harm. That said, a lot of states are fighting back. We talked about Just Cause. There's about 11 states right now, including the District of Columbia, that have Just Cause protections, and there's 4 additional states who are looking to extend Just Cause in this session. So Connecticut's not alone in this fight. And then we're going to talk about anti-criminalization legislation, and Connecticut is one of 10 states right now looking at this legislation. There isn't legislation right now that exists. We're hoping Connecticut can be one of the first and really create that model moving forward. And so this is where the federal and the national is really local, because here in Hampton, we all know we've got really unique challenges. We've got the foundations in New Hallville that are crumbling, and we've really got to fix those. We have really high rental and homeownership cost burden here. We've got 47% of our renter community is cost burden, and about 32% of our homeowners are cost burden. So that means that you're paying more than 30% of your income towards your mortgage or your housing costs or your rent, which is not something that's sustainable long time, right? Long term. And we all know, we can't ignore the elephant in the room. We have our revals that have come, and everyone is nervous that cost burden on the homeowner side is going to go even further. We're working really hard to make sure that doesn't happen, and I see fellow council members in the room. But these are all things that really are on top of mind when we talk about housing, and when we talk about some of the unique challenges that are here in Hampton. So we passed the Housing as a Human Right resolution, and it really is aspirational, right? We all know right now in our country, housing is not a human right, but we want it to be. And so what that meant for us as a council is really tying that thread of what can we do at the town level. We're going to make sure that we're not criminalizing people for experiencing homelessness, that our police are not finding or arresting folks. And we all know, we've seen folks who are living outdoors in our community, and we want to make sure we're using humane approaches to our fellow community members who happen to be unhoused at the moment. We also want to make sure that we're using the tools we have to address the lack of affordable housing. So how are we looking at the land we have and land trusts and what we're doing? How we're using our block grant funds, how we're leveraging other funds. And then we also want to ensure that we're leveraging the tenant protections we can through our Fair Rent Commission, and that we are working with our state delegation to leverage state funds. We know we don't have enough here to meet the need with our local resources, but we want to be that voice at the Capitol to say, here's what we need and what the state can do to help us out. And that's what's really exciting, I think, about this forum here, because Rep. Sweet has taken a lot of what we've done and has been able to use that Hampton experience and bring that to the state legislature. And so the council had written a letter back after we did the resolution, we hoped it would be ordinance, the resolution to really push for Just Cause and the anti-criminalization piece. And it's so exciting to see all of that happening now. So we just wanted to kind of set sort of that stage, because we're in a really unique time right now, where we haven't seen some of this, and that makes these pieces of legislation even more important. So I want to take a moment to introduce Caitlin Rose, who is here from the Stewardship Service Center, and who has been working closely with the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness on the anti-criminalization legislation. And she's going to talk to us today about what that is and what it's not, and where it is in the process. So I will turn it over to you.
It's really great to be here. If you were wondering, I'm not Sarah Fox. If you were here to see Sarah Fox, I apologize. I am a Hampton resident. I've lived here for 3.5 years, so part of why I am someone who works in a different part of the state, but I am a resident here. I've had my own housing challenges here in Hampton, so I'm really happy to be able to be here and talk about this legislation. I'm going to be looking at a few things on my phone, so excuse me if I'm not looking directly at all of you, but I want to be able to give you some kind of quick stats just to ground us in when we're talking about unsheltered homelessness and what decriminalizing homelessness would mean in a place like Hampton. In 2024 calendar year, 1,340 residents called 211 for housing needs. 211 is one of the pathways to get access to housing and resources. So 1,340 people from the town of Hamden called. From there, 182 people ended up getting a coordinated access network appointment. That just means they were referred to someone in the community to talk to them. Right now, there are 90 people from Hamden in a rapid rehousing program or a supported housing program. So that's the best case scenario out of a worst case scenario. For someone who ends up becoming homeless, they end up getting housed. Right now, we have 2 street outreach workers in the city of Hamden. That's a newer program. For a long time, Greater New Haven really focused their efforts in the city of New Haven. So the fact that there are outreach workers working in Hamden is fantastic. Right now, there are 25 people known to the system that are experiencing unsheltered homelessness. So when we're talking about decriminalization of homelessness, that's kind of the number we're talking about. There was a warming center for cold weather, December, I think it's open January 1st to March 31st, it just closed. There were 35 beds, I believe, and those were full every night. Some folks were able to get housed out of that. But right now, again, known to the system is 25 people that are your neighbors. So what this legislation is intended to do, and I have a very rudimentary slide here, is really not looking at decriminalizing homelessness to allow for tent cities, to allow for people to languish on the streets. What it means is when there is someone on the street, there's going to be a differential response to try to connect that person to services. And the city has already been putting resources towards being able to meet that response by having outreach workers that are dedicated to the community, by having a very own cold weather program to bring people to. It's an agreement among constituents that when there is someone in need, that there's going to be a response that is compassionate and is helping that person move towards what they need. So what this is really saying is that there will not be a penalty for engaging in basic life-sustaining activities. That language may sound vague. What that language means is somebody sitting, sleeping, laying, existing in public spaces. This doesn't mean that someone in private space is not subject to anything that might come from trespassing or anything like that. It also doesn't mean that anyone that's engaging in illegal activity is exempt from anything, right? It doesn't mean that people can defecate in public places. It doesn't mean people can do drugs in public places. All of those things that are still illegal are still illegal. It just means that if someone is on the street and you don't have somewhere to go, the option is not for police to come and give them a ticket that they likely cannot afford, but they will connect with the outreach workers to come and engage that person to try to connect and bring them into services. For some context around just the larger landscape, in our numbers from last year, 2024, homelessness increased 13% across the state. We don't have numbers yet for 2025. We'll have those in May or June. But 12 people this year died in cold weather across the state because they were unable to access services. There is no community that has enough resource for the people in need. It's funny, 1 in 4 people seeking cold weather services were turned away for lack of services. It's astonishing to think about the number of beds that were brought online in cold weather, and it's just not enough. So fines and tickets are not going to get us out of this crisis. It has to be a multi-pronged approach. I think that's also important to understand. It's not the intention to decriminalize homelessness and have nothing else happen. If we decriminalize homelessness, we pair outreach services, we try to create more rental protections. Ideally, there are less people flowing into homelessness, and we can really focus on people that are on the street to help get them out of homelessness. Hamden is a small enough community that this seems incredibly doable. We don't want there to be the cycle of people ending up in jail because they've ended up on the streets when already the amount of traumas that somebody has experienced to end up losing their housing is probably traumatic enough and cost enough. I want to make sure I've added everything in here that was requested of me. I think just the fiscal reality, I have some notes here. Hospitalization for someone that's experiencing homelessness averages $3,300 a day. Emergency room visits cost about $1,600 a day. Incarceration costs about $282 a day. Housing and case management is $62 a day. We would rather keep people out of the criminal justice system and house them and get them back on it. I will give one small anecdote actually before I pass this back, because I didn't, I didn't give too much of my background. I live in Hampton now, but I lived and worked in the city of Los Angeles, who decided that this was the strategy that they wanted to explore. And obviously larger landscape, but I just want to tell you a little bit about what they uncovered. The city spent $3 million to dismantle 174 encampments. 2 people were permanently housed. 94% of the people that they encountered to dismantle their dwellings expressed interest in shelter, and only 18% of them received shelter. So criminalization is known to be actually a very costly endeavor. I am here as a result of leaving that environment because that was not an environment that I really found that I could continue to work in. Watching people's lives just already be challenging, and then have the community that's intended to support them actually essentially erase them from public view is not something that is worth taxpayer dollars, which I think is important to all of you. I'll pass it back in case there's areas you maybe want to add to on that.
So I think we want to open it up. I know last time we didn't have a lot of time for Q&A, so we want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So please, I will pass around a mic so folks online and can throw all their questions.
So, I'm a longtime Hampton resident homeowner. My question is the definition of criminalization, because I know in New Haven, they have taken down a number of homeless shelters and, that's not the right word, tent encampments. But they haven't arrested people, except when there was a demonstration by supporters of the homeless, and some of them wanted to be arrested. So, I mean, are there, and I don't think they're arrested in Hampton. So are there places where they literally are arrested and taken, either fined and or taken to jail? Or is that really not the definition of criminalization?
So that is the definition of criminalization. So New Haven, there's sort of like, there's lots of sort of layers to this. Like in places, they are finding and arresting people. So where this came out of, mentioned the Supreme Court case, which was Grants Pass, Oregon versus a woman named Gloria Johnson. And Gloria Johnson was living in Grants Pass. She was unhoused. And she was fined for, there was no shelter beds. There's no shelter in Grants Pass. And she was fined for sleeping outside when there was no shelter provided. And she had, and several other her friends were, and she had went to pursue the town to say there was no place for me to go. How can you find me? This is not cruel and unusual punishment. And that was found, yes, the court sided with her, but then this went to the Supreme Court. So, and the Supreme Court said, no, actually, this is the cities and towns can make the choices. Cities and towns can make the choices to do what they want to do. So unfortunately, it is happening in places. People are also taking down encampments without housing for folks to go to, right? So this is a very complicated issue, because in those cases, maybe folks are not arrested and they would not be covered by this piece of legislation, right? That option still exists for mayors or towns to do, is to relocate encampments. Do we think, I mean, I can only speak for myself, I can't speak for the panelists, do I think that's a good idea? I don't. I think when you relocate somebody without having housing, we've seen that you're just moving folks somewhere else. You're putting their belongings at risk for losing them. Oftentimes their ID is in there, medications could be in there. Sometimes you're disrupting a community that is supportive of each other. I mean, nobody wants to see an encampment. I understand that, I agree with that, but the solution is not moving that encampment to somewhere that's out of sight and out of mind. The solution is really intensive targeted outreach and engagement with access to housing, with support services. And we've seen that work. Places like Boston, there was a encampment community right outside of Mass General Hospital, And the mayor worked really hard to make sure that they did intensive outreach. They worked with the housing authority to have vouchers available. And it takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes a lot of time to, not a lot, but a few, a little bit of time to do that. But that is really the path to go. So it is complicated, and this piece of legislation does not forbid the engagement to move encampments. If it is done though, we would hope it was done with offering people housing, offering people access to the two shelters of their choice and that meet their needs. I think the other thing that's really important is just having a shelter bed may not be enough, right? Sometimes you've got a family living in a car or living in a tent, and maybe there is an opening at a shelter that just has a bed for a male, or maybe it's a man and a woman and a child. And that shelter may not be appropriate for that family, and to ask that family to be separated is not an appropriate option, right? You have to really, this is really about being human and meeting our neighbors and human needs. People may have disabilities, or they may have service animals, and we just have to make sure we're thinking holistically about our neighbors who happen to be unhoused and offering them solutions that meet their needs.
Sarah, I have a question.
There's people online.
I think you've already answered my question, but it seems that a weakness of this bill is that it is explicit about not sanctioning tent cities, and it seems that, from what I've been hearing, that I'm pretty sure that a whole lot of people in tent cities would rather be in a more permanent structure that might have heat and water and real beds. But if you don't sanction tent cities, but you don't have the resources to provide other reasonable housing or shelter, then it's unclear to me how much this bill will. It's great, it's a gesture, but it's got an Achilles heel here. Okay.
So you're absolutely right, and I think Caitlin could talk about sort of the other legislation that goes kind of, this is part of a package where you're absolutely, we need additional money for shelter, for housing, for all the other pieces to make this work. So
Sure. So the Connecticut Can End Homelessness Campaign has requested $33.5 million in housing assistance and different services to be able to meet this moment. That full ask was not in the governor's budget, but there is money for this in the governor's budget, which is good news. It's not enough, it's not the full ask, and there are cuts from the federal level coming to us for services and housing. So any investments from the state will be supplanted, or any funds from the federal government will be supplanted by state funding, which means break even at best. So you're absolutely right. I think, again, this multi-pronged approach with just cause eviction, there's different discussions about landlord registries. There's a lot of different ideas of just trying to make housing more stable so less people are inflowing into the system. But until we do those things, we will not be able to get outside of this, because it's very easy to slide into homelessness, and it is very challenging to slide out. I'm sure many people in the room understand that very intuitively. Rents have gone up. It's not so easy to maintain housing. Moving is challenging. Moving is expensive. So we've got a lot of prongs that we're trying to attack with this. Lori's the co-chair of the End Homelessness Caucus. The state has chosen to create an End Homelessness Caucus to do listening sessions and really try to push different types of legislation. I think we've had more bills come through the Housing Committee this year than any year before. I've sat and listened into a lot of those meetings. It's very interesting what's being discussed. And most legislators are actually very interested in solutions. But money is not gonna get us out of this. Money's not gonna be, money to respond is a lot more expensive than the money to just keep people in their homes. Do you have other legislation?
can just briefly talk about the three things we're trying to get done with the End Homelessness Caucus. So one is an interagency, because we know groups like the CAN are boots on the ground and doing the work and are excellent at the work. So we want people, like we're doing with the Fair Rent Commission, so that we have roundtables and we can talk about best practices. We want folks at the table so they can be, sharing notes. So we're working on an interagency bill that did get out of committee. The 33.5 million that got sent to appropriations, that came out of the housing committee. And then this bill, 7033. Those are our three priorities of this newly formed End Homelessness Caucus.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for this presentation and this bill. You all have already heard my argument about this whole thing. I've been saying that the state of Connecticut needs to do more to prevent homelessness.
Right.
They don't do enough. And I've always said that they need to bring on more RAP vouchers. They need to expand the state RAP voucher program, because wouldn't it be awesome if somebody tries to pop a tent here in Hampden and the police go over there and say, no, you can't do it. We're not going to arrest you, but we're going to give you a RAP voucher so you can go get a damn apartment. Like, wouldn't that make life a lot easier? And the state of Connecticut needs to, that could be coupled with this kind of legislation to say you're going to expand the state rental assistance. We cannot rely on the federal rental assistance program. As you know, it's all going away slowly but surely. But our state has the resources to expand rental assistance programs for people that are at risk of being homeless. And we need to also look at a registry of people, of not just, like your typical registry, but ones where people are couch surfing, staying on houses, sleeping on somebody's floor, staying in auntie's basement because you can't afford your rent, your hours are cut. There's so many reasons why people are at risk of being homeless. And to try to do all we can do, that this wouldn't even have to be kicked in. Like, we want to not have this kick in. Because this is the worst case scenario. And I think Connecticut needs to do more. Next year's fund in the state legislature would be, putting together real live homelessness prevention. And there's so many prongs to it, like the rental assistance. The state of Connecticut needs to do more by putting more housing on the streets, building more housing, making that easier. That's a freaking nightmare in and of itself. Let a nonprofit developer try to go to CHFA and get a loan. No offense, I used to work there. Try to go there and get a grant or a loan, and you better roll up in that bad boy with $500,000. Tell the truth, right? Maybe 7. You better roll up in that bad boy with 7 in order for your application to even be looked at. And that's a problem. And see, these are things that people need to know. Just to do housing in Connecticut, it's ridiculously expensive. That's why we end up here where people can't find housing and they're sleeping with their kids in the back of their car. And it's really a disgrace for a state to be as wealthy as it is, to have these pockets of really horrible poverty where people are being faced to sleep in their car. Everybody sleeps good at night knowing that. We're all good with it. We're not good. It has to stop. And we need to be bold, and we need to be courageous to go to the state and say, you need to put some housing vouchers on the street. If we see anybody that's in a tent, we're going to roll in there, give them the paperwork. I don't care if it's on their credit report. We don't care about any of those dumb things. We're going to give them a voucher. They can go find their own housing. And that's going to be forever. It's not going to be one of these little, when you get back on your feet, we'll take your voucher away. That's another whole night. Oh.
Yeah, say it more. Ronnie, you're so right. And during COVID, I just want to say, during COVID.
It was horrible.
It was horrible, but we actually learned so much in the housing field during COVID because, one, we were using hotels. We closed down a lot of shelters and we were using hotels, and then for people experiencing homelessness. And that was a hugely successful model. If you all notice, the street homelessness really decreased during the COVID years. It's increased now, it's skyrocketing up, but during COVID, we used hoteling. We said, you know what? You can't be in congregate setting because that's dangerous. It's a public health crisis. You're going to have a hotel room. And so we used hotel rooms, funded them, that worked. Then we had an eviction moratorium, tenant protections, that prevented people from being evicted. We had emergency housing vouchers for people experiencing homelessness, and those vouchers got rid of all the bureaucracy related to the housing voucher program. You didn't have to prove all the things you had to prove. And then we provided emergency rental assistance for folks who were housing insecure, so they wouldn't get evicted and they could stay in the home. And we saw homelessness rates decrease, eviction rates decrease. It worked. And now all of that funding has gone away.
They're reeling it all
Is
back
what
in.
happened. So here we are. So we know the solutions to this, and Rhonda, you just like hit it, like, and we have the
Let's
money
start.
in the state, and
We do
I
have
just
to.
wanted to like remind folks, like,
We have it.
we know the playbook, we just gotta do it.
Yep.
So I'll let you.
Just terrible.
I also wanted to say,
Terrible.
the-
They know it.
Well, yes, the first 2 years of the Right to Counsel program, and I should be clear also, the Right to Counsel is still being implemented, and not all tenants have been represented, even with about a fifth of tenants having access to a lawyer. $36.6 million was saved. I mean, that's money that shouldn't be pocketed in a sense, but instead it should be shifted over immediately into everything we're talking about. And then secondly, in what was found in the evaluation of Right to Counsel, 22% of people served by the program said that they would have otherwise been homeless. So that is with Right to Counsel in the context of Right to Counsel for tenants during eviction proceedings, in the context of having no fault evictions. So if we were to expand just cause eviction protections, because legal lawyers will tell you, it's great we have Right to Counsel, but we also, in addition, really need just cause eviction protections. Those savings would go up that should otherwise then be shifted over into everything everyone's talking about here. And then also more people would be prevented to falling into homelessness. And I'll leave you to talk about it.
Well, I would just add that we need to adjust the guardrails, but that's a whole separate evening, so we'll go back to other questions.
Mhm.
The degree of homelessness, as Rhonda mentioned, sleeping on one's couch and doing things such as that, just because you're not outdoors,
Yep.
you're still homeless.
That's right.
Auntie's basement.
The effect of that, goes beyond much of what we talk about, and if you have to give up your home or your apartment, moving in somewhere, what do you do with 5 rooms worth of furniture?
Mhm.
Okay? The byproduct of that type of thing is the storage industry. Okay? And maybe there have been conversations of that, I haven't heard it, but the storage industry has just gotten completely out of hand. People are caught in these situations for whatever the reason, they have to put their things into storage in a matter of 60 days. If their financial position may cause them to be delinquent, they cause them to do whatever, the time frame by which these facilities have to abuse the people is outrageous. People can have their entire life belongings now auctioned off and sold. Liens are put on, additional. The average cost that I'm aware of, if you are 30 days late, is what, $120? If you're late paying $75, how are you not gonna pay an extra $120? So I just think some consideration should be given to that industry as well. Because if you look at the numbers, that industry is booming, okay? Why is it booming? It's booming based upon the topic of this discussion.
Hi, everyone. My name's Paul. I've been a tenant housing organizer for the last 4 years. I've also just been qualified. I've lived in my car in my life. I've had to do that for about 4 months at one point. Yeah, only people who know the knock on the window when you're sleeping in your car understand that. And as far as criminalizing, just to expand on that, just because you're going to jail doesn't mean taking your home and all your possessions, throwing them in a dumpster isn't criminalization. That's punishment by the police, as far as I'm concerned, whether it's official or not. I did have a question for Alex. Hi, Alex. Always love your stuff. I heard there's companies now buying up people's individual tax debts and using that to leverage to get their homes away from private owners.
Yes, been doing that.
Have you heard about those programs?
Yeah,
Yep.
so people do have liens placed on their properties, and then those are sold off, they're kicked out.
Yep.
More broadly, actually, I want to turn that on its head. There's potential for policy to take tax liens or whatever set of liens and actually you could transfer that to community land trust, so people would stay into their homes. You could take otherwise delinquent and abandoned properties and transfer that again to the community, go to the land bank, which then goes into the community land trust, that can be converted into various forms of shared equity housing. So there are a lot of things that are happening that, I mean, the example that was just given, imagine instead of the police coming and arresting you or coming with handcuffs, they're coming with a voucher. It's the same thing with liens. Imagine instead of an institutional investor coming in and buying, effectively taking over your property, your home, and then kicking you out, there was an avenue or a vehicle to actually keep you in your home, and even in a sense, piece that together with you being part of the broader community, and that's part of what community land trusts do, which were featured in one of the last lines in the housing human rights resolution. And the reason being is a kind of signature point in terms of what we can aspire towards. So yes, that happens. It's unfortunately talked about less. There are all sorts of horrible ways in which people have even had their medical bills against them to have their homes bought up by sometimes like nonprofit, corporate hospitals. I mean, there's a lot of examples of things like this happening. There is an alternative. I mean, that's a lot of what we're talking about. There is an actual alternative, and these are not pie in the sky alternatives. Everything we're talking about is something that has happened somewhere, and even something that has happened somewhere in the United States. It's not even something that has happened somewhere in like Sweden or Denmark, or it's something that has happened here in the United States at the local level. I mean, the examples we were hearing from Councilwoman Gallagher were exactly that, right? I mean, we did a lot of these things during the pandemic, and so this is one example where this proposal has popped up, the one I just spoke about, in terms of what you could do with liens and actually keep people in their homes and preserve that. But unfortunately, yeah, this is within the malaise of all of the horrible things happening with renters and homeowners. This is one of them that happens.
I've rented in Hampton, been very fortunate, rented in Hampton since 1985 and owned a home since 1993. But I've seen a lot of decay over the last few decades. I mean, there's many buildings in Hampton, like the two banks on Circular Avenue in Dixwell, or the Moral Motors lot, or the YMCA up here, or the Skiff Street former LA Fitness place. There's a lot of abandoned property now in Hampton, storefronts all over Spring Glen. The shopping center with just a Walgreens in it, about 6 acres of empty parking lot. I mean, and I'd like to see Hampton do some aggressive eminent domain the purchases of these places. And, some of these places have water and power, and they're all set to have people living in them. The St. Stephen's School on Ridge Road, those places make great apartments. And, that's what I'd like to see happen, is the town going into the business of apartments and condos.
I mean, this goes back to this, actually. See the park right there, right? What about preserving, right? We talk about building and building and building, but we don't talk about preserving our housing. And that's an example of that. And so, let's be generous and say that Connecticut does have a strategy around developing affordable housing.
No, they don't.
Let's just be the most generous we possibly can be.
That's real generous.
Thank you. But let's just say it's real, it's happening, and it's there. We don't have a preservation strategy at all.
No.
And that's what you're pointing towards. And that's what Paul's question pointed pointed towards. It's a lot of the point. We don't actually have that. I mean, we have maybe bits and pieces. I think there was some bonding put out there for a homeowner, keeping homeowners in their homes. There's been little bits and pieces that have been happening, but overall, we don't have that conversation in terms of what is our strategy for preserving homes or preserving housing supply. And that was this is part of the point of framing it this way in terms of the leaky bucket. What are we doing to not have this happen, right? To not have this proliferation of holes in the bucket that is our housing supply that results in a falling off a cliff. And so that's just another dimension of what that means. And there are ideas out there, and again, there are ideas from around the country and around the world, and again, constantly point to things that can be done. But I think that's a great point, and it adds up to that. And that's what I want. It's addressing that. I think there might be others who have thoughts on that specifically. But I do think it's important we keep in mind, like, there's a larger framework too, right? Because we need to have these larger frameworks in place so we can have a really, really robust, strong, assertive conversation about what we need to do to move forward. Because a lot of the stuff should just be bundled together and done in a really thoughtful and grounded way. And there are definitely solutions to things like this.
Right.
I think we do have a bill, I'm trying to remember, there's a lot of bills, thousands of bills, converting commercial to housing that came out of the housing committee, so we'll have to follow that.
Just to add, since we have 2 council members here, zoning is a local decision. So we can tell our council members that we want to revise zoning to be able to do exactly what you said. I'll join you at the meeting.
Yeah, no, thank you for saying that. The word's absolutely out of my mouth.
Yep.
When we
I've
look at
been saying that for
something we have
years.
here in Hampton, it is a little bit antiquated in the way that we actually think about how we can disperse housing across town. Where I think it's due time that we actually think about that. Where it's always been funny to me when you look at it. There's certain parts of the Dixwell corridor that are zoned a little bit awkwardly in terms of not being as dense as it possibly could be, or not actually being possibly zoned towards mixed use. Those are the things that we should really be thinking towards, because any housing that we can add is something that is super helpful. And it is a little bit of moving out of older mindsets, where to give a little background and context on it, Hampton isn't Hampton right now is about 60,000, 62,000 or so. Once upon a time, we were a small apple orchard, and we still have zoning that is akin to what you would expect of a place that still has that character. We've long grown past that, and it's time to actually make sure our zoning actually fits that. So I actually chair the Economic Development and Municipal Planning Committee, and that is totally something that I've talked with Mr. Moses about, and a couple of other folks, and something that we really are looking to get done. So yeah.
Thank you, Councilman. And I'll say this is where we, as council people, need you all too, because a couple of the places that were mentioned here, the YMCA, the Walgreens, there has been conversations around housing development in those places. But when that happens, neighbors come out, they don't want it, they're afraid of schools, they're afraid of traffic, they're afraid of, so we need community. Then we need community organizing.
Neighbors want to Y out. Y had no plans to put it in, and enforce them. The neighbors in that neighborhood forced them on them. Because they were gonna keep that property, get rid of the neighbor. They left because of all the harassment from the neighbor.
That's where we need you all, help and support these initiatives.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is not so much about the details of the bills, but more so about buy-in and the ethics of it. I guess what do you say to Hampton residents who can't see themselves in these bills? I have been really bothered over the last few days seeing people just comments about the flyer for this, that people should be paying more attention to the budget concerns right now, and they don't see the correlation between the budgets and them complaining about the possibility of losing your house, that that are in need of these services? Like, what do you say to people who can't, like cognitive dissonance, like they can't see themselves in what you're presenting?
Yeah, I think this is part of why I had this constructed this way, this presentation. I could give you a whole version in terms of just focusing on the experience of renter, my experience as a renter. But I think it is really telling the story in the visual. Again, one of the reasons why I brought up the Nakasak Valley Project's roots is because that's a story that a lot of us, and a visual that a lot of us are familiar with. Person who worked in the factory for decades, job gone, community torn apart. That's never coming back, although, you know, we talk like that's something that will come back in some kind of, you know, same synonymous kind of way, right? But that's sort of walking through. I mean, you can imagine, again, like an entire neighborhood. Again, I'm going to sort of reiterate, this is part of the story, that, okay, your town that once, let's say, had some manufacturing, gone. Your town that now has largely care sector as the biggest jobs or services, that's now bought up by the same. I mean, private equity, right, in a way, is just another name for some of what we saw in the 70s and 80s. Okay, so again, so now that happens. So, okay, factory's gone. Hospital, owned by private equity. Now your house is owned by private equity. Or now your neighbors' homes are owned by private equity. And those mortgages are doubled. Your mortgage is the same, but now your house is, I mean, sure, I bet a lot of people like their property values going up. I bet you don't like to see it double, you know, or triple within a very finite period of time, because you know that likely means your taxes are gonna triple along with that. So that could mean you are ending up in a situation where, as Paul said, right, you have a lien placed on your property, you can't pay it, and then what happens? It gets sold on the open market. That's where it gets these liens off. When it gets to a certain point, they're sold on the open market, and it's gone, and it's owned by the same people who own your neighbor's house. So I do think we have to tell, those are real stories. I think we have to tell that story and paint that picture constantly. Yes, it's the numbers, so, you know, careful about, you know, how we talk about the numbers and how they figure into that. They're very important to us. But the numbers actually do have that kind of an arc. That's the arc behind the numbers. That's what neighborhoods look like. In some states, institutional investors, or some metropolitan areas, institutional investors own like a quarter of single-family homes. I mean, we're talking about tens of thousands of single-family homes. So you can very easily end up in a property like that. So that, I think, is what, and not everyone will buy it, you know, and some people refuse to see that could happen to them. That does happen. That happens in any form of union organizing as well. That'll happen in labor unions, intensity organizing. Very, very rarely you'll get 100%. Sometimes you get 100%. But people, because you don't want to think something that bad could happen to you. But it's important that we actually keep saying it over and over and over again, because the way things are going, it could very well happen, and it's important that you have told that story to them, or you have painted that visual for them, because they are prepared then for when and if that does happen, or if and when that does happen, to then actually reflexively respond. You know, you could argue, oh, is that too late? You know, maybe not for that person. So I think it's not enough to just talk about, I think. Again, I could talk about my experience as a renter for hours, for hours. But we have to move people from where they're at, and it won't always work, but it can, and it matters. And that's the work that we do with the All-In Alliances. Sarah Bromley here is part of that. That's the work that we do. It relates to zoning, relates to getting on commission. Like that's part of the work that's done to actually tell those stories of housing insecurity. And not just tell the stories of housing insecurity personally, but also how as we start to surface those, how much they're held in common, and we do have solutions, and we actually start to build power and use power collectively, locally. But the vocabulary is going to look so different. it's gonna look so different often than what we're accustomed and comfortable with.
I've got online, but we'll do it online. This is an online question. First is an idea. What about claiming eminent domain over those big apartment complexes and then convert them to resident co-ops? The second question, is there any thinking on helping older and poor people to be able to keep our homes despite the rise in real taxes? For example, in Chile, when people reach a certain age, and maybe depends on income, well, the elderly are not subject to taxes. How about making it possible for elderly poor to be exempt from property taxes on their home?
So I think you all can speak to details, but again, I want to make a broader point. Something else that's really kind of insidious, I think across the country, is that this is an example to me where we have suburbs and exurban and rural settings pitted against cities. And this constantly happens on so many issues. And that's where we need to develop vocabularies that parse right through that and show that because now we're talking about issues around money again. And that's where something like suspending right now, or deeply modifying the fiscal guardrails, fiscal roadblocks. We have a set of financial constraints that are statutorily built into the state and how it does budgeting and financing. Those being modified are, and money is not the only solution, as I said, it's not. But in something like this is where we are sort of forced into situations where we're like, well, why do they get money? Why do they get money? Why do they get money? And there are much longer conversations that deeply get into that because the federal government figures into that, as a currency issuer, all of that. There are ways to actually tackle that, but the way we can tackle that is first and foremost, we have to be able to build power across urban, suburban, rural lines. If we don't do that, then we can't possibly have a push to get to bigger policy goals or aspirations. It could be something like that. As we heard, that's something that happens in another country. I very well believe that, and there are sets of other policies that can happen that way. And one of the differences is that we have these sorts of geographical, that are also racialized divisions that create this constant deadlock. And so it's conversations like this that need to happen all around the state, all around the country, to actually start not just breaking through, but flipping them and building alliances to get to bigger policies like that.
And maybe that's something sweet for next year, because a lot of our tax policy is based off of state statute. We don't have the ability to change here, but we do have veterans exemptions as well as, I think there's elderly ones that you can look on the website when you look at your property taxes, but maybe that's something that you could look at with others. And I have a feeling that Sarah had something to talk about around the elderly housing, so.
Absolutely. First of all, I love to, it's like order a pizza and let's just stay here the long term. I want to know all of you, and I want to this is a great conversation. I'd love to just have more of these in all of our towns, right? Hampton's great. So before I forget, I made some buttons for everybody, and to your point, how do we move the dial on these things? But a few years ago, even a few months ago, I wasn't all that comfortable talking to anybody I met about housing. And now I'm much more comfortable. And one thing you can do is just wear a button. I made buttons. There's some buttons over at the table as you go out. Some say housing is a human right. Some say housing, not handcuffs. And they're conversation starters. All of us can, have conversations about housing and help people connect the dots to why we should all care about this, So what you said also about planning and zoning, that's one of the things we're doing. I used to think planning and zoning was a snooze fest, and now I'm getting into it because I go with friends, and we go, and then afterwards we go out for a pretzel and a drink and talk about it. What is that? And it's real, you can get into it, and it's really moving the dial in some of our towns. But one thing I wanted to ask too, what do you all think, and we need these bills, and we should all be pushing for them, and more.
But what about, are there any conversations around home share, for example? My stepdaughter is a case manager, Home Share Vermont, and 2017, they made 98 matches. 2021, 191 matches. They get funding from lots of places, not just the state, but the state, because there's not enough like nursing homes and things, you can age in place. And it's just, no new, and it's the quickest, most cost-effective way to get some housing quickly. Because you're just matching people up with background checks and an organized Craigslist. And I'd love to see that be investigated. And then another thing was like, what do you all think about, like, not so far from here either, in Rhode Island, the pallet communities? We saw the success from our moteling, and other states are trying this, right? Investing in those as transitional, but having a place of your own with a door you can close and lock, and having supportive services there. Those are two things that I wanted to know, like, what you all think about those and how it's going in Rhode Island.
I think we need all the things, and I know there was a tiny home bill that got referred to appropriations for 10 million. I think they're 3D printing them, which is.
That's even cooler.
I think we need all these things, and I think we need to be really creative. And I just want to shout you out, Sarah, for the work that you're doing for All In. I remember being at the Capitol a couple weeks ago, and the room kind of emptied out, and people were popping up on Zooms at 3:30 in the morning, and it was homeowners testifying for Just Cause. And thank you for the work that you're doing. I think you're just a testament to an individual person can organize and bring people together, and actually, that really changes the conversations for us to be hearing from homeowners that they want this. So I just want to shout out the work that you're doing and grab Sarah's buttons, and let's continue.
Grab a button.
I also wanted to speak to the comment about the cooperatives. So we steward, as stated earlier, we steward 102 units in housing cooperatives, meaning that the people who live there own and run their buildings or complex democratically. They elect officers. We as Nonprofit Valley Project conduct trainings and workshops and provide support in a variety of ways. What I wanted to say with that is that might seem like a rare, weird thing. In New York, there's a huge, thriving co-op sector, not just market rate, limited equity, so it's affordable. Some countries, in Sweden, I will bring up Sweden.
We should have just
37% of multifamily housing is cooperative. I think it's 37, or nearly 40. Which means it's possible to scale these kinds of models. These are things we're all talking about that are not just possible on a pilot basis. It's one of the things we do that's really bad. And it's important to say this as well with all the ideas, because I love that we're in the space in this conversation that we're actually really suggesting really concrete ideas that have legs to them and that have history. The one thing I want to say on all that, whatever idea you have, this is whatever idea I feel like I've had, probably someone's done it, look into it and make that point. Because the reason why I say that is that what we often do is we pilot something and then we set it up to fail, and then people try it again 30, 40 years later and act like it's some new, great, amazing idea and pilot it again and set it up to fail. I can give you an example. So for part of my dissertation work, I was looking at cooperatives, in this case, a form of cooperative schooling, and I was mentioning to somebody, to someone who had talked in one of these schools, like, oh yeah, this restorative, have you seen this restorative justice work that's happening in schools? And one of the points was, one of the systems was like, oh, we did that 50 years ago. So likely someone has done it, and you should learn from it, because one of the ways in which we set these programs up to fail is by not retaining any of the institutional knowledge and not learning from it, because it's complicated to do some of these things. We shouldn't be overly romantic about some of the ideas as well that we're presenting. They are complex to sometimes implement, especially within environments that are fairly hostile. And hostile is something we've actually been pinpointing. So we have these histories, and I encourage you to look into them
make that a part of when you're thinking about your ideas, because we can take it a step further, we can say, look, it was already piloted. Or in fact, it was already done at scale. The only reason why it exists anymore is because someone took away the funding, or somehow in some backdoor way found some statutory ways to mess with it and further undercut it. So I really appreciate everybody sharing those ideas. And so my ask to all of you is to go even deeper with it and come back with that so nobody can shoot it down. Or say, yeah, great idea, I love it, I'm gonna get a little famous off of it. And it's gonna be a pilot, and then it goes away and we do the same thing over and over again.
Got one last question here, or two last questions. Well, we're after 8, so I just want to
Yeah.
acknowledge we're running late. If folks are okay, I'll see these 3 questions.
Yeah, mine isn't
and
really a
then we can-
question. It's just a comment.
Ah.
The hardest homeless group to house are those coming out of incarceration. That's another thing that the state of Connecticut needs to look at as their exit strategy. They've never seemed to have one that works well. And the best way you want somebody to reoffend is that they come out of prison and not have a place to live and be able to get a job because they have their criminal history now held against them. So these are also things that need to be added to the list of prevention, homelessness prevention plans, is please look at the formerly incarcerated folks. They have to live somewhere.
Absolutely.
I would say, there is a lot of property that could be rented. I am a property owner. But because the rules are so for the renters, you get screwed on your property. I got 75% of one of my floors damaged by a tenant.
Mm-hmm.
And if you might be able to get some of your money back for nothing at all. And some people won't rent their building out for that reason. And some people will rent it, but they'll rent it for a B&B for part of the year or certain rooms or certain part of the house, just because that's better protection than renting to a regular tenant. Or they only rent to Section 8 because they know they'll get 90% of their money or 70% of their money or whatever it is, and maybe not get that much damage and maybe get something taken care of to do with it. And that's, you're not protecting the property owners. And then when our taxes go up almost every year, at least for me, I've been here 20 years. Every year my tax for the city of Hampton has gone up. And that's another issue.
Sure.
So I'm one of the case managers that were briefly mentioned earlier, that works for the town of Hampton through a grant. And I'm very new to it. I actually just started on the 31st of March, and I got my own first client today. I've been chatting with people in the meantime, but what we do is harm reduction is one thing, so making it safer to be homeless. Ultimately, we get them into permanent housing, and in the short term, we try to get them into a shelter. But something that I've noticed is that despite the fact that Hampton has very progressive laws when it comes to homelessness, there are not a lot of places for them to go, especially now that the warming center closed. We're seeing tents being propped up in playgrounds. There are some along the canal trail. They're in places that I feel like they only go because there is not somewhere that's safer. So they're being told by DOT, by Public Works, that they can't be there. The tents are being taken down still and everything like that. So my question is, A, what can I do to make that safer, to make it safer for them to be in a situation that they're in, and what is being done to make it so that there are more options before they're in permanent housing, while they're still on the streets, and while we still need to provide those services. And what can I do to work with legislators like yourselves to make that a reality and to make it safer for people who are in housing?
Great question. So something you can do, and I would encourage you to work through your supervisor, and I'm so glad you're here, is ask for a meeting with Public Works and with the police to get a sense of what are their feelings from the top, because our individual police officers behaving in ways that are different than the police chief is maybe communicating. One of my my colleagues here from the city of New Britain, we work together with the city to do encampment to house projects. And it's been really great to have everybody at the table, because if one police officer is engaging differently than the chief of police, there's an immediate communication loop back as to somebody being out of line with the messaging. And then also, if the chief of police is not on board, and I have no idea, if anyone from police departments here, please correct me, I have no idea, but if they're not on board with this, that gives also the opportunity for council members to engage them too. I think having that clear open communication with the community stakeholders is really important, because it's not gonna make your job any easier to get people housed, but at least in the meantime, you know that you've got people that are all on the same page with you, and supporting the same messaging that the town is ultimately saying is the messaging.
I just want to say welcome to Camden. We're very happy you're here. And I think Lori and I would love to help facilitate that conversation and have everybody working together, because ultimately we need to hear from you, because you're on the ground of what's needed and how we can help facilitate that. So welcome to Camden, and we'll be meeting with you. Lori, I see a couple more hands, but I know we're after hours. What do you want to do? What do folks want to do?
Y'all are comfortable. I only have one more slide up because
Okay.
some upcoming events. Hartford and Hampton and Guilford, but if y'all are up for a couple more questions.
Guys, let's for a couple more questions. That's not
But it's 3 years to do, there's an apple and no bar, somebody's hungry.
The elements of this conversation, I think, is very complicated, but needs to be addressed, is the increasing number of homeless people who have mental health challenges, maybe is the way to put it. That has not entered this conversation tonight at all. I think we're all aware of the fact that as, you know, your community mental health center facilities became reduced, there was a direct increase in homelessness. It's been going on for the last 50 years. And so that further complicates just taking someone who's, you know, got serious depression or mental health issues, that's living in a tent somewhere, and actually expecting them to behave like someone who just had, you know, just lost a job and be grateful for this voucher and just go, you know, do what they can to rise up again. It's very complicated. And so I'd really like to hear your thoughts on this mental health homelessness interface, because that's an added layer of resources that, like, is not been part of the conversation tonight. And then the second thing, since we're coming to an end, is we're all here. Do you have like an ask of us before we leave?
Sure. There's people certainly that are experiencing homelessness, that are using drugs or struggle with mental health, but there are plenty of people that are housed that use drugs and struggle with mental health. So I think it's not, in my opinion, advantageous to come at it from this lens, because I think the people that are experiencing homelessness in our community are more often or not experiencing homelessness because of economic reasons and not because of mental health. That doesn't mean that that's everyone. There's certainly going to be folks that are really struggling to maintain their housing because they're exiting institutions, there's something going on. A lot of times the experience of becoming homeless, it becomes its own mental health trauma. And so it's not to say that that's not something that exists, and you're absolutely right. For those cases, that does require an additional level of service. It's not just going to be our street outreach worker that's going to be able to manage all of that. You're going to need to bring in medication management or maybe a clinician. But I think when we're talking about the reality of homelessness in 2025 and the nosedive that our communities have taken, it's economics. And so I think that's why that's been the focus, because that's something that our council and our state can do something about. As far as the ask, I'm going to pass it to Lori.
Yeah, I think you're right on, Caitlin, but I do want to acknowledge, this is why the support services is so important when we're talking about what we're talking about today, and that having case management. And there's been lots of, over the past
5 to 10 years, there's been movement to have some of those services funded by Medicaid. And there's been, in Connecticut, there was a pilot that had funded Medicaid services for supportive housing. Unfortunately, I'm nervous that with the landscape moving forward and cuts to Medicaid, these are probably some of the services that are gonna be harder and harder to access, but it is something that's really gonna have to happen through partnerships with other service sectors. But, and Caitlin is right on, I mean, I think we do see an overlap with substance use and mental illness, but the causality is, we can't say that people with mental health issues or substance use are more likely. It's an economic, but the experience of homelessness, oftentimes it's trauma in and of itself. So we have to be really careful when we talk like that, but there is definitely a service at home that's needed.
I just want to add one thing. It was Councilwoman Gallagher's leadership to get $1 million of ARPA into the CAN for the next 2 years. That includes the CAN wraparound services, it funds our warming center, and out of that, we just had a meeting, was that in March? It was like a roundtable of all the different providers. Our elderly service director was there, community service director was there, the CAN was there, the medical team that I didn't even know we had was there. We got the number to call if someone is having a crisis, in a mental health crisis, to get someone here, you know, somewhat immediately. These are all things that we have been asking for because we deal with constituents who have mental health crises and we don't know what to do as electeds. So because of that, because of how hard we pushed for that, we're now in a position to have these conversations. And, you know, now we're trying to strategize for what can we do better at the warming center. People need a place to store their things. They need a place to wash their bodies. And so we're trying to think as we're looking at, you know, renovating the cute bathrooms, is there a way to put in showers? So because of your leadership, and I know not everybody was on board at the time when we were pushing for this, this is where we're at. And these are the conversations that we can have. Whereas previously we had staff working the community center 9 to 5 and then staffing the warming center. I don't know how any human can do that. It's asking too much. Now it is contracted out to the Columbus House. So I just want to say, you know, as you can probably tell, these are issues that we care deeply about. We funded it through ARPA so that it is not your tax dollars paying for this. We're trying to be really creative and come up with out-of-the-box solutions to make sure that everybody is housed. As you know, we believe it's a human right, and I think it's this collaborativeness that is really nice right now. I feel like we're in a good place to really be brainstorming how to make things better for folks. And
What does CAN stand for?
Coordinated Access Network.
Thanks, I'll be quick. I really kind of wanted to draw on a thread that I feel like has been underneath some of this conversation and has become a lot clearer to me doing this work over the last few months. Is that, you know, the reason that we are seeing rising homelessness, the reason that we need tenant protections is because housing has become so commodified. It's not profitable to build housing for people who are unhoused or need supportive services. It's not profitable to build housing that serves the lowest income residents. For individuals, people see housing, especially for many of the homeowners in the room, as an investment. And the reason that we need that investment is because there's a huge lack of social services and a social safety net. So you need to be able to sell your house in order to afford retirement. You need to take out a home equity loan in order to pay for a nursing home for your aging parent because there are no other options. And so I'm a really big proponent of decommodification of housing and moving towards other more equitable housing models like community land trusts. But the legislature also needs to acknowledge that if we're removing that piece where you can really churn a big profit on your home, that we also need to provide additional services to fill that gap so that people can treat their home as their home and they don't have to see it as an investment. I
I will say though, homeownership is the quickest way to generational wealth, and we have just groups of people that have been locked out of that because there's not enough housing that they can afford or is even available to buy because corporate America's bought it all. So it is like this just very generational issue that we're impacting, so.
Yep.
So one of the other things we've been working on the Cook Valley project is trying to prevent nursing home closures. And so Waterbury since 1995 has lost 926 nursing home beds, and it's down to 50. And that's not unique to Waterbury. Waterbury's just that. It's just the epicenter of this. But this has been happening for decades across the state of Connecticut, and it's accelerating. In part because it's not viewed as profitable, and a lot of this does come from Medicaid, and so we'll see what happens there with that. But we're trying to. One of the reasons I bring it up too is that it's very related. People bank on having that, and then it's taken away from them. It is effectively someone's home. For some reason we don't talk about it this way, but it is a nursing home, and people who do spend time in nursing homes pretty much live there 24/7, more than many of us spend in our houses or apartments. And to lose 926 nursing home beds is to lose 926 units. Additionally, there was actually a recent news piece, I think it was in CBS nightly news, where a senior living, assisted living complex was bought up by a private equity firm, and people who had signed contracts had their contracts totally messed with, and I think saw something like the doubling of their housing costs. So all sorts of things were thrown in there. And this is again goes back to why we need. You don't just need. This is why something, for example, HB 6889, right? Why I brought up this point around single family. We need to make these rights and protections as broad as possible, because, okay, maybe on the books there is some set of illegal activity going on. I don't know. I don't remember that very well from this news piece, to be honest. But the fact that something like that can occur and people feel so, and maybe in certain respects almost, have, if not powerless, have the power heavily tipped against them. I mean, it shows like, okay, let's say you saved up your whole life, or you built equity your whole life. In order, in part, thinking, I will be able to transition into a complex like this with all its amenities, and those amenities are taken away. This happens. I'm sure people could speak to stories like that in apartment complexes they've lived in, but say senior living complex. Your housing costs go all the way up, and all of a sudden, all of that equity you built up in your prior home in order to save up for your retirement is all gone. So this is becoming quite common. And so to Kayla's point, there's something incredibly, messed up. We think, oh, it won't be us. It's not going to be me. I've had this thinking even working in this, right? And then it happens. And it happens in a big way. And you think you've done all of it right, and you probably did do all of it right, but because of the power dynamics that are embedded and are being accentuated, they are becoming bigger and bigger. The power bounces are not just tipping; they are really flipping in really horrible ways against a lot of us. Including, again, you're a homeowner who has owned a home for 40, 50 years, and you thought you had that to then go into something like this. And so that speaks broader. That speaks to the broader issue that we have. That we're not. That's why we need to have even these conversations we're having around what the broader framework is and attack these issues, because small fixes are not going to do it. Small fixes are going to be a Band-Aid, or they're going to be sort of like, hydrate, cut off a head, and then two more pop up that are against you.
Yes, so the commodification of housing, completely agree, it's complicated because one, we're not in a climate where that's going to happen right now, right? And so we have to figure out how to provide universal vouchers to everybody who needs one. But I think the second thing to think about, and I have this conversation a lot in my day job, is when we think about about social housing or decommodified housing, we still have to think about folks who are the lowest income because they are often forgotten in those conversations. And when we think about it, we still have to talk housing for everybody and ensure that those have the most barriers to housing have access to that housing. And we can have a whole, this
No,
is,
it's not like that.
no, well, I'm gonna say there's a whole other, like, we can have a debate on the panel about nursing homes.
my
Because,
God.
there's been a movement on the Medicaid service to have home and community-based services, so people are able to age in place in their home, especially people with the lowest incomes who are often forced out of their homes and into publicly funded nursing homes that are institutions and then are institutionalized in their end of their life. So there's ways to ensure that with home and community-based services, also Medicaid program and rental assistance, people can age in place in the community. That's a whole other topic. I'm gonna give up the mic because I will talk to everybody. I want to say thank you, everybody, for coming. It's been a
Thank you so
great
much.
conversation. Find your representative, you know where I stand on this. You can also contact your senator and ask them to vote for these bills. Some upcoming events, the End Homelessness Caucus is going to be screening Where Then Shall We Go in Hartford next Friday, but there's a local film screening at the Unitarian Society of New Haven, which is actually in Hampton, even though it's called New Haven, Sunday, April 27th at 1 p.m. Again, that's the documentary on Rosette Village, and then in Guilford, they're having a homecoming brunch in May that we were also invited to. So if you want to keep this conversation going, and if these are issues